right. Well, thank you everyone for hanging in there. I am super excited for my last guest. There should be more people around. So if you're not sitting here, get your butts over here because this is going to be an exciting conversation. If not, she's all mine. But okay, one final intro. My name is Stephanie. I'm a science communicator, multimedia producer, and this is my 15th interview for these last 3 days. So I'm a little yapped out, but I'm still excited to end on a strong note. I'm so excited to be talking to Ruth Morgan as our last conversation. She had a talk yesterday called Building Trust, Rethinking the Social Contract Between Science and Society. So as someone has a PhD in science communication, has thought about the science of science communication, I wish I was at your session. I was over here. But I really am curious as to, like, what do you mean by a social construct? Like, where do you even start into thinking about this?
How long's everyone got? No, I'm joking. So I think this really came out for us in terms of thinking through what we're observing today. Mm-hmm. You know, we're seeing a really interesting ecosystem where science is definitely not perceived in the way that it was, say, even 10 years ago or even 20 years ago. And so tracing it back, it's really, really interesting. So you see the treaties that came out after the Second World War. So there's a lot of trust in science, and Vannevar Bush put out his social contract for science sort of treatise. And in that, he was talking about the brokerage that there is between society and science. So if society supports science, gives science and scientists freedom and autonomy to go and do their science, there will be benefit to society that comes out of that. Mm-hmm. And I think what we've observed over the last 80 years is that has changed. Mm-hmm. And we are now seeing a system where, because trust has been eroded, that contract has, if that's the, I know, there are lots of people who don't like that word, but it kind of serves the purpose, I guess.
Like
but
the status quo almost, in a sense,
Yeah, and actually we have become far more prescriptive about what we need science to do for us. Mm-hmm. And we're saying, you know, we've got a particular agenda and we're going to need science to provide this particular capability or this particular outcome that we can, that will contribute financially to the national financial agenda. And it's become far more customer contractor. Mm-hmm. And I guess that's where we're beginning to see where that erosion of trust has come, and are we actually trying to do science within a context where science can't actually be all that it could be, and are we restricting the value that science can bring to society because we're not giving it the autonomy and the openness and the opportunities to be creative and to make those discoveries in places that you might not know necessarily in advance are going to be where you're going to find those discoveries. So that was the sort of thinking behind the session.
Yeah. Is there, like, looking back into kind of like the science history of like when there was like, you know, when the social contract kind of developed into, like, have we been able to kind of pinpoint when like that trust started to dissolve? Do we know or no? It was just kind of like a vibe, like everyone started noticing.
I think it's a direction of travel, I think.
Yeah.
I think, you know, different countries and different settings, it's happened in slightly different ways. Yeah. But I guess it's the overall trend that we observe. But then, you know, we're beginning to see, you know, the Pew research that shows that the trust in science actually is maintained at relatively high levels in quite a lot of countries. But that contract part of it is quite interesting. We've created a system where scientists are in competition with each other for resources and for visibility. We have come to the point where there are certain fields, certain topic areas that are deemed more valuable than others. You start seeing a real preference towards certain subjects, less resources put into, say, the arts and humanities. Certainly in the UK, that's what we've seen cuts in those areas, whereas we've seen more funding going into STEM subjects. And I think that's been a big sort of catalyst for the work that we're doing, to try and think, how do we take what's good? How do we see the challenges and how do we think about what might it take to get us to a point where actually you've got science able to thrive and able to bring that good in society, which maybe it's not doing.
So is the ultimate goal to kind of get back to a place where science has like more freedom and autonomy to do what it needs to do without like the real implications of it benefiting the society? Or is it kind of like, I guess like, I don't know if that's a good question, or if we can go into what do you think does work right now, what is not working, and then what are we rethinking to kind of like propose a new solution for this contract?
Yeah, love that. I don't believe in going back.
Okay.
Because that
it was a different time.
It was, and context is so important. So the other piece of my research area is in forensic science, and that's very much about thinking about how does science engage in the justice system, and there's so much there about context and evaluation and interpretation and being able to handle uncertainty in a context where beyond reasonable doubt is the goal. Sorry, so I don't know if we can necessarily go back, but I think we can move forward. One of the things that we're looking at trying to help in that situation and explore what might be possible is thinking how can we have more diverse and more broad conversations that bring different perspectives together. So the work that we do within the institute that I co-lead at UCL in London, it's called the Arista Institute. It's a co-lead it with a wonderful colleague of mine who comes from the Faculty of Arts and Humanities. I come from the Faculty of Engineering. And people often say to us, how on earth do you work together? Because you have completely different perspectives and you bring such completely different lenses to things. And it is so much fun because there's somebody always going, what? Why do you think that? How on earth did that ever work? And in that kind of friction, you start getting to some interesting places. So we are very serious about how can we bring the literary scholar and the ethicist and the philosopher together with the computer scientist, the biologist and the geographer to ask the questions that keep the computer scientist up at night with the question to the ethicist, and how do we pose the questions that keep the philosopher up at night to the biologist, and trying to draw out then these points of tension that mean that we can ask different questions. And so I think that's part of the answer. How do we broker between the different disciplines? How do we actually create spaces where all the disciplines are actually connecting and in tension, but also working together? But then the other piece of it is how on earth do you get the knowledge and insight that exists within the university, which is such a wealth of insight and knowledge? How do you get that out into the real world? And we use a metaphor because we get ourselves tied up in knots otherwise. So we think of the university as a meadow. All the different disciplines are different plants and different flowers, but the only way a meadow is going to survive and thrive is if you've got bees that will cross-pollinate, traveling from plant to plant, cross-pollinating as they go. And then it gets kind of cool because there's tens of thousands of species of bee that can do that, but there's only 6 species of bee that can make honey. And transform that pollen into honey that can go out into the real world, into the hands of those who can actually be the change makers. And so that is the other thing that we're trying to do. And I think that's how you build a new contract, by creating space for bees in a meadow, but also creating opportunities for the honeybees to do their thing, to do that transformational work of sitting in the uncertainty, sitting at these intersections, getting all those wrestles that are happening, but doing that in a way that will engage with a particular challenge in a particular time to a particular person who can actually then take that science and utilize it along with all the other forms of knowledge that exist.
Who would be the honey makers in this context, or like a context?
You find them everywhere. I don't think it's not that all academics are, or that all this type of person who's been trained in this particular area. I think it's a mindset. I think it's characterized by curiosity. It's characterized by a willingness to not know and to be comfortable with not knowing, and to be inquisitive, to be curious about why somebody has a completely different perspective. But I think it also has to be done. You don't see a single honeybee. It's always a big community. There's always a hive.
If our current social contract is like a lot of scientists are competing with one another for like resources and, you know, for funding or now we're in a place where like, yeah, we're no longer kind of have the dictation of who does that, or it's changing and constantly changing in our current time. I guess, like, do you think we're only able to like have this social contract with the public once like the scientists are able to collaborate, or is there like something, you know, is there another meadow happening between like the society having to maybe, yeah, like society having to kind of like meet us halfway? I don't know if that's a good question, but
so I think there's definitely multiple meadows.
Yeah.
And we need the connections between them. That we need to have porosity between those boundaries. We need to have bee highways between our meadows. I think this is all about people. So I was talking to some people earlier, and one particular person had a very rich experience of telling the stories of science. But every single story he told, it started with the name of a person. And I think there's something incredibly profound about valuing and recognizing the value of the networks of people that you've got involved. And so something I think I'm very passionate about is often it's only possible to dedicate time as an academic to building a network of people outside of your discipline, outside of the university, once you've reached a certain career stage. And that means that often you're coming to it relatively late on. But those kinds of relationships take so much time. They take real investment, and it takes time to build the trust so that you can have those ongoing dialogues. You can ask those difficult questions of the other. So we should be starting that much earlier. We should be rethinking our reward and recognition structures within academia so that that type of skill, not everybody has to do it, but I think for those who find that something that gives them energy and fuels their research and teaching and innate curiosity, they should be allowed to do that. They should be rewarded for doing that, because that was going to pay dividends. Imagine if everyone started building a network, by the time they're mid-career, by the time they're senior, the depth of those relationships, that would be pretty cool. And that's where you get change.
Because I feel like right now, like at least in the academic sphere, is like, okay, we're prioritizing innovation and research. We're prioritizing publication, like mentoring graduate students. But like service, depending on the institution that you're at, is usually kind of like the afterthought or like the smallest thing. Or like sometimes, like an example for me, when I was pursuing my degree in chemistry, like they saw my efforts in science communication or like my service as kind of like a distraction. So like, what do you mean? Like, so how, like, yeah, so what would be, like the best case scenario to kind of like incentivize more community building, more like service orientation, as also having the same weight as innovation and research, if we're trying to rediscover or recontextualize the social contract in order to rebuild our trust?
So I think there's something about having portfolios rather than a one-size-fits-all. I think there are some universities that are beginning to do that much more, and research, teaching, citizenship, and entrepreneurship are 4 attributes, and they're all considered. But I also think it's going to take some trailblazers, and a willingness to accept that within the science community you need diversity. You need some people who are brilliant researchers, you need some people who are brilliant teachers, you need some people who are brilliant diplomats, you need some people who are brilliant storytellers, some who are brilliant connectors. But that doesn't, as a whole, we all do better when we have all of those skills represented, rather than enforcing a one-size-fits-all. To be an academic, it looks like this.
It goes back to your point of like having the freedom to do all of this and the autonomy to like make these decisions.
I think so, and I think it's allowing people to find what they're good at.
Yeah.
And that means people have to have opportunities to try things, and if it doesn't work out, that's okay.
Yeah.
How do you know until you try?
Okay, so aside from like the scientists and the academics, like what do you think, or are there moments where we can like pinpoint like where do you think we're failing that's like not helping the society kind of like see the value and importance of like science? Because I'm chronically online. I see a lot of news, and I don't know. We can go down a rabbit hole in that sense, but I guess it's just like we know there's a distrust in science, and it just feels like we're hitting a wall. But like, why? Like, what do you think? Do you think, like, I don't know where I'm trying to say. Like, do you? What are your opinions on like where you think we're failing at in terms of like why the society is not resistant or just like at butting heads with us at this point.
So I think Rhonda Moore was on our panel earlier, and she said this beautifully, I thought, which was that in our schooling, in science, the way that science is taught in school, you don't get to the part of science where there's real debate about how stuff works and less certainty about what's going on until you hit university. And so an awful lot of people are leaving school who have engaged with science, but science is presented as this very clear, very, it's a very unequivocal, empirical, there is a right and a wrong answer. It's not until you get to the next level where you're actually exposed to the idea that actually scientists can look at the same data and disagree about what it means. And so I think there's something very, very important there about how do we encourage and enable everybody who's going through school to see firsthand that science actually is very uncertain. It's part of the way science works. It's not something to be fearful of. It's not something to minimize or to squash down. It's actually something to delve into. It's what gives us hope. It's what enables there to be another way through, if not now, in 5 years or 10 years' time. So I think there's something very much about how do we deal with uncertainty? How do we make it, how do we infuse into our public understanding of what science is, that science is about making
mistakes and also
and revising and doing better, and getting closer and closer and closer, but never being to the point of being able to unequivocally, often not being able to unequivocally say the answer is always going to be this or this. And I guess the other one is about humility. So I think that's the other thing that to make progress, the thing that we're not doing very well at the minute is being able to be wrong. And it's very, very scary, particularly as a scientist, to say you don't know, or to say, actually, I got that wrong. And yet, I think without it, we're not going to make progress because we're not going to be open to alternative explanations. We're not going to be open to revising in the light of new data. There are so many things that I think we can learn from the people who made massive breakthroughs in the past. They often were very well versed in multiple disciplines, and they were almost always wrong at some point.
Yeah, but I think like even in communicating uncertainty or like saying that we're wrong, like sometimes that comes with like pushback or like even adding to like the distrust. So, and another thing that I've been having a conversation with through this meeting or with just colleagues in the science communication space is like, okay, we know we have to reach the children, but the who has power of like what's dictated of like what we're teaching in school still ends up the adults,
Sure.
the adults in the room.
Very
so we still have to we know we have to like impact their minds or like since we're at an impressionable age to like make them citizens of science or more science thinking individuals as they grow older since like the way we are presenting science is so like this or that. But like how do we I think it's still a struggle of just like convincing the importance of like the uncertainty or like the messiness or the process of science at such an earlier age.
Totally, and I think that's where it comes down to people and relationships again.
Yeah.
So I've heard again this wonderful phrase that we need scientists at the table, not on tap. And this idea that we don't want to wheel science in when we've got a problem that we need fixing. We want science to be part of that conversation in an ongoing way, in an open way, so that when a problem arises, science is just a natural part of that conversation rather than wheeled in like a sticking plaster to sort out a particular problem. So I guess science isn't separate from the scientists.
Yeah.
Policy isn't separate from the policymakers.
Yeah.
So everything that we can do to have that ongoing dialogue, because I think sometimes we're very, very good at creating opportunities for people to talk, but it's what happens after that and whether that continues going forward. And there's a great example from a country representative from the UNDP that I was speaking to, and he was talking about the level of soft power that is involved when you're trying to offer advice, and just, going fishing with a few people week by week by week ends up with a conversation about the death penalty, and to what degree is that going to be the solution to the particular problem that was being faced at the time, and what alternatives might there be. And that was all done on a fishing trip.
And I guess, okay, so I feel like we do talk about the, I don't know, at least from some of the speakers that I brought on, a lot of the solutions that they're proposing are this interdisciplinariness, or knowing that there's a diversity in thought and background, but with diversity being also a trigger word, I guess how are we this sounds great in theory. We know we have to do this, but I feel like it's still hard to make this actually happen. and is there infrastructure that we're lacking, or just getting everyone on the same path to buy into it in order to make this happen, knowing that this is what needs to be done, or not? Yeah.
So you're so right. You're so right. And I think there isn't a simple answer.
Yeah.
But I do think one of the ways we can move forward is to get much, much better at the way we tell our stories. Mm-hmm. And I think the universal language of the human is the stories that we tell. And we need people to commit and become absolutely brilliant at telling the story of science, and listening to the story of policy, listening to the story of different groups, of different knowledge systems, and being able to then weave these stories together. I've been accused of being an idealist, and I certainly am, but I think we need a good dose of idealism at this point, because actually if you look at the nuts and bolts of it, it can look really bleak. Mm-hmm. But I also know that what I've observed over the last, over sort of the historical time, is that people are really ingenious. When there's a challenge, they do figure out a way to find a way through, and that is what gives us hope. I think that, and you see the generation that are coming through. There's a lot of passion. There's a lot of motivation and a lot of will. Mm-hmm. So I think, we've got to hope.
Yeah. Please keep me optimistic. Okay, as we wrap this, anyone have questions for Ruth? No, you're all on your phones? Get out of here. Okay. No, do you have any questions for me, or anything you want to bring up, last minute conversations, or?
I think just,
what are you hopeful for, or what are you optimistic about in terms of rediscovering a new social contract for our future?
I think a meeting like this is really exciting, because people have come from all over the world, mm-hmm. and actually there are rumblings.
Yeah.
I think people see that the current way works brilliantly for certain challenges, for certain ways of working, but there are certain challenges which are not being best served by this particular approach, mm-hmm. and therefore there is space for exploring new ways. And I think I'm beginning to hear that more and more and more. So mm-hmm. collectively,
okay.
I think we're going to get there.
Yeah. All right, well, I'm glad I got to connect with you, Ruth.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. Round of applause for our guest. And also a round of applause for me. I did 15 of these things. I'm exhausted. I can cry. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for AAAS for giving me this opportunity. And just thankful for this fruitful conversation.